Welcome back. In the last few videos we've had loads of fun making beginner blacksmithing projects, but there's one important thing that we've been neglecting: the fire. So, in this episode we're going to be making a fire poker and a coal rake. Two essential items if you've got a solid fuel forge. For both the poker and the rake, we're going to be starting with a piece of 10mm by 10mm mild steel, long enough to comfortably hold without tongs. We're going to start at the handle end, where the process is the same for both the rake and the poker. And we'll need to make a mark of 6 inches on the anvil. I then use an aggressive angle and strong blows to create the initial set down cleanly, so that I have a clear mark to work from for the rest of the set down. This set down material has nowhere to go other than outwards, but we want a consistent width of 10mm as a continuation of the bar, so we'll dress that in. Then we'll draw out the handle. We'll align the set down with the edge of the anvil by sliding along at an aggressive angle until I can feel that notch. Then I raise it back up to horizontal for drawing out. You'll get cleaner results by hammering in the same place and drawing the material back towards you. Fighting the hammer's momentum to move it is difficult, but moving the workpiece is much easier. This allows you to be more consistent with your hammer blows, resulting in less mishits and hammer marks. You'll notice I'm also turning the piece on its side and dressing any excess width back in. As previously mentioned, you want the handle to be the same width as the bar. When it's drawn out to length, I find around 16 to 17 centimeters is about right. We're going to shape the cross section of the handle. I tend to use a small swage block, like this one, to hammer the handle into to shape it into a half round cross section. For the tutorial though, I'm assuming minimal tooling, so we'll do an approximation of this just with the hammer and anvil. To do this, with the notch we made earlier facing down and locked into the edge of the anvil, we're going to use a combination of tilted hammer blows to taper the edge of the handle, and also turning it onto its corner and striking down to break the edges a little more. This diagram illustrates the point better. As the edges thin down, we use light blows of changing angles to tidy the handle cross-section into a neater semicircle. Again, better demonstrated here with this diagram. From this shaping, we may have distorted the edges, so we turn the piece on its side, and then with light overlapping hammer blows, we flatten the edges out again. Next, we want to put a taper on the end. This is going to become a scroll. Therefore, the longer and finer this taper is, the more delicate the scroll will look. Start with around 15mm on the end and draw this out to a thin point around double that length. If you want more information on tapers, see this video here. When the taper is of a desired length, we need to round it out. To do this, turn the taper 45 degrees so the corners are facing up and down, and hold at an angle so that the whole taper is in contact with the anvil face. Then strike down. Then turn 90 degrees and do the same thing on the other pair of corners. Repeat as necessary until you have a regular octagonal cross-section. Then, when you have an octagon, you can just roll the taper under the hammer with repeated light blows. Keep going into the darker heats, since the cooler it is, the less the steel will move and give you a more and more smooth surface. Next, we'll put a little scroll on the end. This is done with a 45-degree stroking motion at the edge of the anvil. Then the work is slowly slid forwards underneath. Don't do what a lot of people do and move the hammer forwards with the taper. If you hammer at a consistent speed, the slower you move the taper through, the tighter the scroll will be. We'll keep going until it starts to double back on itself in what I call a rat's tail. Other people probably don't call it that, but I have 4. I'm biased. Next, we'll place it back in the fire with the tip of the rat's tail facing upwards. This keeps the thinnest part out of the hottest part of the fire, so it doesn't burn and the whole taper heats evenly. Finishing the scroll is probably the trickiest part of hammerwork in this video. We'll hold the taper and hammer flat, think 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock on a clock face. Then, as we hammer, we'll move them up towards 12 o'clock, hitting all along the length of the taper. Then, if the end of the taper hasn't rolled into contact with the bar, reset and repeat until it has. For bending the handle into a loop, I'd usually use a jig for speed and consistency. But, again, assuming minimal tooling, we're just going to use a hammer and anvil. The first step is to bend the handle 90 degrees, with the rounded side facing downwards and the shoulder of the set down facing up and in line with the anvil. We hammer down to create the bend, then the shaft, since it's also hot, bends a little, so we correct this on the face of the anvil. When we place this back in the fire, we want a nice even heat for looping the handle, so we'll place it across the fire, like this. Before we form the handle, we'll cool off the scroll to ensure that it doesn't get deformed. To form the handle, it's very similar to making the rat's tail earlier, but using the horn instead. We never want to hit the handle where it's in contact with the horn, since this will squeeze the metal. We hit beyond the horn where the handle is in free air, so it uses the horn as a pivot and bends round. As the shape gets closer to what we want, we do light blows while lifting and lowering the shaft, turning the looped handle on the horn. This evens irregularities and gives a consistent round handle. Next, we'll do the water twist. I like having a chisel mark down the centre of the bar for decoration. I'd usually do this, holding it in a holdfast, using a chisel with a guide made for 10mm bar. When in use, it looks like this, and it's a really useful tool to have, but since we're assuming minimal tooling, we'll hold it between our legs and use a hand chisel. I'd recommend a glove on your chisel hand at this point, since the radiant heat is a lot. Not shown, but we'll repeat this process on all 4 sides. For this next step, you'll need a wrench and a vise. Since we're just twisting, it doesn't need to be a leg vise. A sturdy engineering vise will work just fine. We'll clamp the bottom of our chisel line in the vise, and then we'll place the bottom edge of the wrench on the midpoint of the line. We'll do a full anti-clockwise revolution. Yeah, I might have got a little distracted and gone an extra quarter. Whoops. We'll put it back in the fire for another heat, but before we do the second twist, we need to cool off the first twist. I like to leave a little heat in the very end of the first twist so that it blends better with the next one. Then we'll clamp at the same place that we did last time, placing the bottom edge of the wrench a little beyond our line and twist, 1 revolution clockwise. At this stage, it can end up a little wonky, but if you straighten it out with a hammer and anvil, it blunts the corners and ruins the twist. So I like to use a wooden mallet and stump, which straightens but doesn't damage the corners since it burns away before it can blunt them. Then we'll just knock the corners off the rest of the bar so it smartens up the piece and makes it look less like it's been produced in a factory. At this point, the handle section is done for both the poker and the rake. And now we'll look at the different ends that we need to put on for their respective rolls. I'm going to cut these off at around 65cm, but if you prefer longer or shorter fire tools, then you do you. To add a little flair to my pokers, when I do the taper, I turn the bar 45 degrees so that the corner is facing upwards, and then I taper the end. If you use this method, it's really important to keep the corners upright. If it leans one side or the other, the whole point ends up twisting. When finished, it gives this lovely diamond pattern, which just makes a pointy stick look much more interesting to me. For the rake, we'll do a set down in the same way that we did for the handle end, but for a length of only around 3 inches. This, however, can be drawn out much thinner than the handle set down. But since we want to control the width, it's still going to be the same as the parent bar, 10mm. If you're getting bored of drawing out and you want it to go a little quicker, you can try drawing out over the horn. This pushes material forwards more effectively, but it does leave dents that can be flattened out on the face of the anvil. For a more in-depth look at drawing out, see my tongue video, here. Once it's drawn out, we'll then bend it at 90 degrees over the edge of the anvil and start to shape the rake. Then, we take it over the horn of the anvil and bend it back to complete it. Notice that I'm holding it at a slight angle so that we're bending it perpendicular to the slanted edge of the horn, not perpendicular to the centre line. This prevents the bend from having a bigger radius on one side than the other. Then, as before, we'll just knock the corners off this end and smarten it up to remove those sharp factory-made corners. That is all the forging for the poker and the rake. Now we just have to finish them. I like to wire brush them to remove the worst of the crusty scale. I've been doing this throughout, though rarely filmed. You can use a manual brush like the one pictured, or an electric drill mounted wire brush like this one, or even a bench grinding brush like this one, whatever you have access to. Finally, we'll gently heat them in the flames and rub beeswax over the surface. This should run like black liquid with a small amount of smoke. Then we'll hang these up to drip any excess off, and you have a poker and a rake finished and ready to use. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more blacksmithing tutorials, there'll be a video popping up over on the right now. If you'd like to support the channel, a like and subscribe is always appreciated, and for even more support there's a link to the Patreon in the description. Bye!